Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion that has been organized by the JCRCs of our respective Jewish federations. I am Mark Friedman, Interim President and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Broward County. I want to thank the professional teams of both JCRCs, as well as the staff in Congressman Deutch's office for making today's program possible. We appreciate all of your efforts. Thank you. Congressman Ted Deutch recently returned from Israel, having participated in a bipartisan congressional delegation that met with members of the new Israeli government, including Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Congressman Deutch also attended the installation ceremony for Israel's new president, Isaac Herzog, former chair of the Jewish Agency for Israel. As you will hear in a few minutes, as Congressman Deutch discusses his trip with my good friend and colleague, Matt Levin, this visit comes at a critical time in the ongoing relationship between Israel and the United States. There are a host of issues that will play out in the coming months and years. How the relationship evolves between Israel's new government with the Biden administration and with Congress, the ongoing negotiations over the Iran agreement, the further development and expansion of the Abraham Accords, the alarming tide of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment here and abroad. So before I turn the proceedings over to Matt, let me tell you just a little bit more about our good friend Ted Deutch. Congressman Ted Deutch represents Florida's 22nd district, home to communities in northern Broward County and southeastern Palm Beach County here in South Florida. Now serving his 7th term in Congress, he is the chairman of the House Ethics Committee, a senior member of the House Judiciary Committee, and a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves as chairman of the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism Subcommittee. As co-chair of the Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, he works to ensure the federal government fully confronts and combats anti-Semitism, both at home and abroad. In the 116th Congress, he introduced and passed major legislation to protect our national security, support our allies, and go after our adversaries in bills including the United States-Israel Cooperation Enhancement and Regional Security Act and the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act. Ted is an energetic advocate for the priorities of his constituents. In the 117th Congress, Ted is working to promote economic opportunity here in South Florida, reduce the influence of big money in our elections, enhance gun violence prevention, fight for full equality for all of us, and advancing, of course, our security interests of the United States, Israel, and our allies. Ted and his wife, Jill, have lived and worked in South Florida since 1997. Prior to holding public office, he enjoyed a successful career as a commercial real estate attorney. Born and raised in a working-class community in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, he is the youngest son of the late Jean and Bernard Deutch. Bernard is a World War II veteran who earned a Purple Heart at the Battle of the Bulge. Ted is a graduate of the University of Michigan, tough to say for an Ohio State graduate, and also of the University of Michigan Law School. And for those of you who are active readers of the Jewish Insider, he is the proud father of Gabby Deutch, one of the Jewish Insider's top-notch correspondents. So I will turn this program over to Matt, and I would ask all of you, if you have questions for Ted or Matt during the course of the presentation, please put them in the chat box, and we'll try to get to them later in the broadcast. Matt, Ted, please. Thank you.
Mark, thank you. Thank you for your friendship. Congressman, you have about 180 people felling in the audience right now for Mark's intro. Mark, thank you and the Broward Federation for your partnership over the pandemic. We've done a number of programs together, and the partnership between Broward and South Palm Beach County is terrific, and we're going to keep going. And under your leadership, I know we'll continue to prosper. Congressman, welcome. We've done this a few times. We're back at it again. Let's just open up with the trip itself. It was a historic trip in many ways. The first CODEL post-pandemic, a bipartisan trip, the first trip by Chairman Meeks. Talk about the trip a little bit. Talk about what it meant both in terms of historic nature, in terms of going there at this moment in time when the transition of government is happening. Talk about it a little bit.
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you, Matt, and I do appreciate, Mark, that kind introduction. particularly the acknowledgement of our daughter Gabby, and by the way, for anyone who has relatives who are thinking about sending their kids to Jewish day school in New Orleans, our other daughter is the admissions director. Just feel free to reach out to us directly. Anyway, Matt, we talk a lot about historic moments, and there are lots of them, but there was so much that we took both to Israel and brought back from this trip. It is a really big deal. There is no trip that has left the United States with members of Congress, no official delegation of any kind since the pandemic started. This was the very first one. And Chairman Meeks, who is in himself an historic figure, the first African-American chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, wanted to go to Israel. And I was right there with him, and I worked with him, and we wanted to go to Israel because we wanted to show support for the Israeli people after withstanding 4,500 rockets being fired from Gaza. We wanted to meet the new really historic government, 8 parties spanning the political system. I know the political range of views, and I know we'll get to talk more about that. And we wanted to show that coming out of the pandemic, some things haven't changed. And starting from a foreign affairs perspective, starting with America's commitment to the U.S.-Israel relationship, reasserting the strong bipartisan nature of that relationship, and making clear to the new Israeli government that we were prepared to work with them in every way we can to ensure their success and the success of Israel coming out of the pandemic and after this conflict. And last thing, Matt, I have the privilege of going to Israel a lot, but representing this community in particular, it is really an honor for me to show up in rooms in Israel where my colleagues watch and everyone says, "Oh, you're from South Florida, you represent Palm Beach and Broward, Boca, and that's amazing." That people know how committed, how supportive, how dedicated our community is. It makes me really proud to represent this community, especially when I do a trip like this.
No prouder than we are when you do that for us as well. Let me talk about the bipartisan nature. It was a two-way street conversation. Was there a conversation with the new government about the need for a more bipartisan approach on their part? Meaning, some of the lessons of the last government, the perceptions of the last government being a little bit more involved on one side versus the other here. Was there a conversation also about the need from that perspective?
There was, and we had a lot of really good discussions, and we met with the Prime Minister, we met with Prime Minister Bennett, we met with Foreign Minister Lapid, we met with Defense Minister Gantz, we met with Mansour Abbas from the Ram Party, and that was a fascinating meeting. But it was clear in the meetings with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, especially, that one of the priorities, obviously the priority is keeping Israel safe and dealing with the security issues, making sure that they pass a budget and solidify the government. There's a lot that they need to do, but they're really dedicated, and they talk openly about working to ensure strong bipartisan support. It was really great to hear. It's a two-way street, by the way. We have to do the same thing and re-emphasize it on our behalf. And we did. And just one example of that, there was a 4th of July event, it took place a few days after the 4th of July, but it was Israel, so it was okay, where the embassy in Jerusalem invites people to celebrate our Independence Day. And it wasn't the big event that it normally is because they planned it during COVID, but the Prime Minister spoke really passionately about his connection to the United States and the time he spent living here. And then Chairman Meeks spoke passionately about his commitment to Israel and how he feels deeply about the U.S.-Israel relationship. Those are the kinds of bonds that we need to build upon, and the conversations that will really help propel us forward.
Let's shift to Chairman Abbas. There's been a little bit of feedback in the meeting that at times was, an open and transparent kind of meeting. The first meeting with, obviously, the chairman, post-pandemic for a very long time, certainly with members of Congress. Can you talk about that in terms of, was it enlightening at all in terms of the direction where his head's at and where they're going with the new government?
Yes, I just want to be clear. We're talking about Mansour Abbas, who's in the Israeli government as opposed to President
Right, you're
Abbas.
talking about, right, no, right, you mentioned that, right.
Because we met with both, and I'm happy to talk about.
Right.
Let me just quickly talk about both.
Right.
In the case of Mansour Abbas, it's pretty inspirational to sit in a room and listen to an Arab Israeli talk about why he made the decision to actually join the government, looking to work with Prime Minister Bennett to meet the needs. The Prime Minister is committed to meeting the needs of all Israelis, Jews and Arabs, and in particular the specific challenges in the Arab community. So that was actually really inspirational. We also went to Ramallah and met with.
Wait,
President
I'm sorry. Can I just interject, Ted?
Yeah, of course.
In the conversation with Mansour Abbas, was there a lot of detail and conversation about some of the recent violence in some of the communities, Lod and otherwise?
Yeah.
The need now as a political party in terms of helping shut that down, deliver the communication that's necessary, so that try to avoid that in the future, which obviously became a scary point in this last conflict.
Yeah, there was obviously a lot of really, we all watched, there was a lot of really troubling violence in communities throughout Israel, mixed communities like Lod, and his focus is on trying to ratchet down the tension. I mean, what he kept saying, and it tracked what the Prime Minister said, which is this realization that he's going to do a better job. His community is going to be stronger. There will be less outbreaks like that if we dial down the rhetoric and really focus on providing opportunity and equality in those communities, and focusing on education and focusing on the needs of his community. And it's good to hear, but in particular, it's good to hear throughout our meetings, because the security challenges externally, obviously, with Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah are serious enough. Those kinds of challenges, the kind of violence that we saw internally is not, that's something that they ought to be able to overcome. And we had a good discussion about the need to do that.
Now let's shift over to Chairman Ross and that with the delegation.
Well, let me go back for a second. I mean, the meeting with the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister is focused on holding these 8 parties together for the good of Israel, and when it comes to the Palestinian situation, he's not, obviously he and the Foreign Minister, he and Yair Lapid have different views, but what they both talked about is looking for ways to provide more opportunities for Palestinians living in the West Bank. And he had interesting ideas on how to do that. And for people who have read or heard about Micha Goodman's good book about shrinking the conflict, and that concept is very much a part of everyone's thinking. And so that was a really fruitful conversation on the Israeli side. From President Abbas, when we went to Ramallah, the conversation with the PA was pretty straightforward. For those of us who think that providing humanitarian assistance is really important, we know that there's more that can be done to help the Palestinian people, that can help shore up, frankly, the PA, so that we're not worried about Hamas taking over the West Bank. But none of that's going to happen until they stop this pay for slave system, until they stop the martyr payments. And I told President Abbas that directly. I couldn't have been any clearer. And he says he knows what they have to do, and I know that they're making these decisions. But as I explained to him, this isn't a matter of taking some action or having your lawyers write a brief and argue why what you're doing is satisfactory. They've got to comply with American law. We wrote and passed the Taylor Force Act because we should not be spending American taxpayer money to support a system like that. And they've got to end it. And we were clear about that. It was I think a very frank conversation about why that has to happen and how it must happen.
Let's move on a little bit to the Abraham Accords, and let's talk about what you heard from the Prime Minister and Minister Lapid about the direction where they're going with the Abraham Accords. What's the next chapter, obviously, as it relates to Iran and the JCPOA. So could you just kind of wrap all those pieces together? Because I think obviously they're interconnected in many ways.
Sure. The Israelis are rightfully very excited about the Abraham Accords and the opportunity to build upon them. We saw this week, just in the past day or so, the Emirati ambassador at the UAE's embassy in Tel Aviv. This is a monumental step, and they recognize it. And we've already seen the exchanges that take place. Foreign Minister Lapid, I had a long conversation with him about his trip to the UAE and what the opportunities that presents to Israel. He's talking about a trip to, I don't know if this is public, it doesn't matter, we're all friends. He's talking about a trip to Morocco to try to lift up that relationship further. Again, Morocco as a part of the Abraham Accords. And then they're talking about other countries that can join because of the opportunities it presents, not just for Israel, but for those countries and for the region. And I mean, look, the big prize is Saudi Arabia, and nobody thinks that that's happening tomorrow, but they understand the need to continue to highlight the benefits. From our perspective as a delegation, there's a strong commitment to doing the same. The Biden administration is committed to it, and I think you're going to see them really ratchet up their focus on this. And it's important, not just because of the opportunities, but because there are shared security concerns as well. I mean, Iran is a real threat to these countries, and working together to expand alliances is only going to be beneficial. So it's a really significant opportunity. And before I forget, Matt, it's also something that has strong support across this new political spectrum. And I want to just try to put this into perspective for our friends here in our community. The new government in Israel has 8 parties, literally from the far left to the far right, and then throw in this Arab Islamist party. It is akin to, and it's hard to comprehend this, but I've been thinking a lot about it. This is like, imagine the President of the United States sitting down with his cabinet, and that cabinet included, as cabinet secretaries, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Hoyer, Senator Romney, and Senator Cruz. Like, imagine that. That's what this Israeli government is. And so for all the time that we talk about startup nation and what, as we should, and we're so proud of what Israel's given to the world, if they can make this government work at a time when you see this spike in partisanship all across the world, including in our own country, this is going to be the next great thing. I'm really hopeful, the next great thing that Israel can do for the world and show to the world.
Did you come away with some confidence that this government can survive, the winds of change there and make a month become 3 months and become 6 months? I'm hopeful. Everyone we talk to is really committed to it. Now, the margin is razor thin, and that makes it exceedingly difficult, but they were brought together because the one thing they had in common is they all wanted a new prime minister after Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that was enough to help them form this government. But to hear the prime minister talk openly about his relationship with some of these parties, Merav Michaeli, the head of labor, is a staunch feminist, progressive labor leader. And Mansour Abbas, obviously, we talked about, the prime minister acknowledged that these are not people that he would have imagined being in a government with, but he's come to know them and come to understand their commitment to trying to make things better for Israel. And as long as they keep that at the forefront, and they all share the same concerns about Iran, their security focus is the same. I think they can succeed. I really hope so. I think it would be great, not just for Israel. As I said, I actually think this would be great for the world. Did you get any sense from the government, from either Minister Bennett or Lapid? And I know this isn't really into the security topics that you were dealing with at the CODEL, but any sense of their approach to the diaspora being any different? I mean, in the sense that that there was oftentimes in our community we wrestle with reform and conservative and orthodox as the issues in Israel play out here. We're a special community that's learned how to deal with them in a way that's different than most communities, and we're very proud of the unity that we've done. Can you talk a little bit? Did you get any sense of that just as a Jewish communal activist and having spent your life?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, and I've been in Israel previously, where there was a time I had an opportunity to have a long conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu one-on-one on those issues specifically. I mean, I these are issues, as you know, that I've spoken out on just because of who I am in my community and what I'm committed to. So I think it's really important. They do too. I know I talked a lot about their commitment to bipartisanship. That's true, but it extends in I think, a much more profound way to their relationship with the diaspora and strengthening that relationship. And it came up some in the meetings that we had with the ministers, but Chairman Meeks and several of myself and several of the other members got to represent the United States government at the swearing in of Bougie Herzog as the new president of the state of Israel. And there's nobody, and everyone who's involved in Federation knows this since he was head of Jewish Agency, there's no one who spends more time thinking about and working on strengthening those ties between Israel and diaspora Jewry than Bougie Herzog. And to be in the Knesset when he was sworn in after Ruvi Rivlin, the beloved Ruvi Rivlin, here's Bougie Herzog being sworn in some 36 years, almost to the day that his father was sworn in as the president of Israel, knowing that he has that commitment. That was, as I think, as sure a sign that Israel is going to continue to focus on that as anything. And then just one other quick point. I had an occasion, not on the trip, but before I left, to talk to Nachman Shai, the Minister for Diaspora Affairs, when he was down here, came down to see the Israeli search and rescue team at Surfside. And he absolutely gets it and understands, for those of us who fight the battles against anti-Semitism, for those who, when we battle against those who don't understand Israel, mischaracterize Israel, attack Israel. What happened at Surfside, as he pointed out, is this group of Israelis coming to the United States, not because of the big Jewish community in South Florida, but because this is what Israel does. They send humanitarian aid workers around the world. But again, that's the kind of thing that the diaspora Jewry appreciates. It's the kind of thing that makes us really proud of Israel and the relationship that we all have with it.
Was there one of the questions that I think people wanted to talk about is, in the midst of this hyper partisanship that we're dealing with so much now, the fact that you're able to have a CODEL and have people, you had Republicans on the trip as well, you had bipartisan trip.
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to talk about some of the polarization either to the left, where you're obviously getting into it with folks on your committee, AOC and others, or are you getting into it on the right from those that we know that are pushing out, some of the wrong messages? So were you able to, in that context of a bipartisan trip, really get into an opportunity to say, can we get back to a centrist place, at least on the issues of Israel, the way we have presented it for certainly the last 3 decades or more?
First of all, I think, people would be really surprised, especially in this context, on a trip like this, to see the way members interact with one another. And a trip, the opportunity to travel together, where you're spending every day in close contact, interacting with one another, seeing the kinds of questions that members ask, which then sparks conversations after the meeting with the Prime Minister, sparks the conversation that we have at the lunch table with our other colleagues about exactly these issues and how to work in a bipartisan way. This is a great way to highlight that. There is the one thing that I hope people take away from this trip is that the efforts by some, frankly, on both sides, who try to make Israel into a partisan issue, one, are dangerous, and two, if we do this right, they're also destined to fail. And yes, the conversations that we had with Democrats and Republicans focused on ways to work together to ensure Israel's security and the growing threat of Iran, ways to work together to make sure that we're building upon the Abraham Accords. Sure, those conversations happen, and we represent America, I think, in its finest when we're able to do it in a bipartisan way like that on a trip.
What is the new government's position on the Biden administration wanting to engage again with JCPOA? Where are they at in terms of, how they're going to approach whatever the Biden administration is going to be doing over the next few months in terms of Iran?
So, look, first of all, the prime minister acknowledged that President Biden is a great friend to Israel and to the Jewish people. He was clear about that. He and the foreign minister, and especially the defense minister spoke about this the way that I think a lot of us do, which is there's talk of getting back into the JCPOA, but he appreciates the conversations coming, the comments coming from the Secretary of State and others, that the deal needs to be longer and stronger and broader. We have to address the problems in the original deal. And the Israelis want to see how that happens. I want to see how that happens. I think people on this call want to see how you do that. But what they've said is as long as they know that there's going to be close consultation with the United States, then whatever the administration chooses to do, if it chooses to get back into the deal or not, their energy is going to be focused on keeping Israel safe from Iran, which means they're going to stay in close contact with the United States, and ultimately that they're going to have to do what's necessary to keep Israel safe. And that kind of communication, which we've seen in the early days of the Biden administration, which is different than it was in the Obama administration, that's really key. And it gives them, I think, greater confidence that they'll be able to work with the United States to confront Iran and to ensure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon.
Did the delegation get a chance to visit Iron Dome and see Iron Dome this trip?
We did not. No, we were in Jerusalem. We had a hard enough time trying to meet with all of the ministers that we met with, but obviously that was a big topic of conversation, especially with the defense minister. And there is great appreciation by the Israelis of the relationship, the $3.8 billion, which is now in statute because of the law that we passed in the last Congress, and the need that they have to replenish the Iron Dome, and the commitment that all of us on our trip made to ensuring that happens.
That was really my question. Was it an understanding? I assume you had some freshmen or sophomores who may not have had an opportunity yet to learn that much about it, but that's great. Let me follow up, and then we'll just I'll take a couple more questions, and I think we've covered a lot of what's in the chat here. But let me just go back and one more. Talk about a little bit about the ways in which we want to take a much harder look now. So the relationship with Iran, the relationship with Egypt, the relationship with Jordan, those haven't gotten a lot of attention. Those conversations come up, especially in the case of Jordan, where we've had issues related to a threat to the kingdom and so what's going on there. Did they express concern about stability in Jordan and what's happening in Egypt in terms of their own war on Islamic terror, in Sinai?
So there was, we had conversations about both. Obviously, there's a big concern about Sinai and ISIS and the need for cooperation to confront terrorists there. But there's, again, with this new government, there's sort of a rededication to there's all this attention, obviously, and rightly so, on the Abraham Accords. But for Egypt and for Jordan, these are peace agreements that have been in effect now for decades, and they're really important to Israel's security. And Israel has rededicated itself to working together and on both fronts, and the United States has as well. King Abdullah from Jordan is coming to the United States, I think next week, and will be coming up to the Hill, and I presume will be going to the White House, meeting with the administration. Israel's working hard to reaffirm those relationships. You even saw just in the past couple of days, and we didn't talk about this, we didn't see this coming, but you saw President Herzog, the new president, have a conversation with President Erdogan of Turkey about the need to try to ensure that relationship is a positive one. So there, with all of this change comes an opportunity to reset and reaffirm these relationships, which is something they're trying to do.
That's absolutely, absolutely. Any last thoughts that we didn't get to about your trip, about the delegation? Do you get a sense that the delegation will come back, especially those in your party on your side of the aisle, are willing to come back now after hearing and having the conversations with Mansour Abbas and others, and be willing to push back on those parts of your party where you're still getting the criticism that you need to? Obviously, you want to see on the Republican side as well. I don't mean
Right.
on that, but obviously, just because you've publicly been in the position sometimes of having to oppose those in your party, at least especially on the committee, on the stance. Yeah. Do you think those folks are willing to come back now and be more outspoken?
Well, I'll tell you. Yeah, I'll tell you what I think about this, Matt, is that they're going to come back strengthened and in a better position to reaffirm what continues to be the strong bipartisan support that exists. There are a handful of voices in Congress, and there are voices outside of Congress, and we need to take seriously. And I'm concerned about. We need to figure out how to confront. But for those in Congress, we need to work hard to continue to marginalize those voices. And the way that you do that is by helping people understand exactly what we saw, what we experienced, the Israelis that we met with, both the ministers, the security officials, people from our own government who were there. As you know, there's really nothing like being in Israel to completely change the way people view Israel. And our delegation had pretty wide range of views going in, but I am confident that we're going to come back rededicated to doing what's necessary to enhance Israel's security and to strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship. And the one thing that I really look forward to is for those colleagues on my far left who continue to criticize dangerously, falsely, and in so many instances ignorantly Israel, its history, and its government. I'm looking forward to having some of these new Israeli ministers come to Washington and show the great diversity. They don't just represent the diversity of the Israeli government, they represent the diversity of the Israeli people. And that's something that my colleagues, I think, really need to see and to understand. And for those of us who were there, it's something that we internalized yet again, and that's a really important thing to do.
Congressman, as always, we're incredibly appreciative of this conversation. I think that we're very fortunate in South Florida to have you representing us with your colleagues, and I just can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with our community, the Broward community, and all of us for today in this conversation. I wish everybody the best. We hope we'll see you guys at the next program. And thank you very much for joining us today. It was really great, Congressman.
Matt, it's my pleasure. I always enjoy talking to you, and I always love when my friends from Palm Beach and Broward come together. So thanks for making that happen.
It's a good thing, especially me, since I live in Broward and work. I put my head on the pillow in Broward, but spend my days in Boca. So I'm with you as well. So thank you.
Look forward to seeing you soon.
You too.
Thanks.
All right, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks
for
everyone.
joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. Okay. Thanks, Matt.